Thank you for listening. This is the Wyoming Photographic Podcast, all things photography from the state of Wyoming, featuring Wyoming-based photographers as well as photographers who travel from all over the world to photograph this wonderful state. I am your host, Jeff Footer, and we have an amazing show in store for you. Today we're going to be talking about wildlife photography, and to help us do that, we've got Julia Cook with us. Julia, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for asking. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I primarily shoot wildlife. Sometimes nature of the wildlife's been a little bit slow. And I live in Cody, so it's only about an hour away from Yellowstone's east entrance. So I spend most of my time up there photographing any kind of wildlife that I can find.
When did you start photography?
I kind of always had a camera around, but really during COVID, like the start of 2020, when everything went online, I had a lot more free time and didn't really know how to spend it. So I got out in nature a lot more and just picked up a camera to photograph any of the wildlife that I was seeing. And I got hooked pretty quickly, and it kind of snowballed from there.
What are some of the best places you've ever been for wildlife photography?
I really think Wyoming's hard to beat, especially places like Yellowstone and the Tetons. But I spent a month up in Alaska last summer, and that was incredible. Just so many different kinds of wildlife and just such different landscapes than we have here, especially being by the ocean was really cool to be able to photograph wildlife in some of those areas.
Who does your inspiration come from?
I'm really lucky to have a lot of different friends that are also wildlife photographers, and I really enjoy shooting in the field with them sometimes. I feel like it can be easy for people to get really competitive, but I really like seeing some of my friends be successful out in the field and don't really, make it turn into a competition. So some of those people are like Evan Watts, Brooke Bartleson, and Tanner Haver are all pretty inspirational to me. And also Amy Gerber, who was a teacher of mine in high school and now a close friend. And we spent some time out in the field photographing stuff together. And yeah, I'm just really lucky to have friends that, share a similar passion.
Absolutely. What clothing do you recommend for photographing nature?
I always say layers, pretty much just like dressing for any of the crazy weather that we can get here in Wyoming. But layers, so in the mornings, especially this time of year, the mornings can be pretty cold, but it gets warmer later on in the day. And definitely any outer layer that's waterproof is really essential, especially in the winter if it's snowing or anything like that.
Now, are there any specific places to go within Yellowstone to find the most wildlife?
I feel like this is a really annoying answer, but there is wildlife all over Yellowstone. I definitely feel like for people that just want to see wildlife, Lamar Valley is probably the best place. But in terms of photographing wildlife, in Lamar, everything tends to be pretty far away and difficult to photograph. But I think time of day matters more than where you are. So especially just getting out and driving around slowly in the early mornings and the late evenings, you should have some good luck finding wildlife pretty much anywhere you are in Yellowstone.
So this question kind of goes hand in hand with the last one, but how do you decide where to shoot?
I feel like most of the time I just go off of where I've been seeing wildlife recently and different trends. I keep a journal actually that I compare, I make a list of any time that I've been in Yellowstone and what I've seen and where. So then I can compare like this time of year to last year and decide where I was seeing stuff and kind of go off of those trends in order to kind of pinpoint where I want to at least start looking for wildlife.
What is some advice you can give for getting tack sharp wildlife photos?
A big one for me, I use autofocus, and I've been going through some photos, and sometimes I have some where like the autofocus pinpoints on the back of the animal instead of the face. So I always try to be aware of where my focus point is when I use autofocus to make sure that like, especially the face and the eye more specifically is in focus. And I also try to use a higher shutter speed just to make sure, especially if animals are moving pretty quickly or, to help stabilize my camera. And a lot of times I'm also shooting like sitting on the ground, balancing my camera on my knee just to help minimize any like camera shake or anything like that. So that's a big tip too, especially with bigger lenses.
What would you consider to be the best photo you've ever taken?
I feel like this changes all the time. Like it's really hard for me to pick one. There's a lot of photos that I really like just because it was such like a good encounter that maybe aren't like the best in a technical sense. But a recent one that I've taken that I really like is a bull moose walking across a river with the fall colors behind it that I took down outside of Jackson. So that might be my favorite, at least right now.
And so your photo was published on the cover of the Outdoor Photographer magazine. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that started about a year ago, and that was an experience I was really excited about. An editor had reached out to me and asked if I could write an article for them and provide some different photos. So it was a really cool learning experience, learning how all the editorial process works and everything. So I, wrote my article and sent it to the editor and then sent different photos as well. And from that, they had picked my wolf and raven photo to go on the cover. So that was a really cool experience. I was on a trip and walked through the Denver airport and I saw, my photo on the cover of the magazine, which was really cool. Unfortunately, though, the business sold and they're not even printing outdoor photographer anymore. And I have yet to be paid for that, which I think was also, another learning experience of like how I think photographers can unfortunately often be, taken advantage of or undervalued. So I'll see if anything ever resolves with that, but I don't think it will.
You're not the only one that I've heard that hasn't been paid by the Outdoor Photographer magazine. Even in the last couple of years of publication, apparently they had some issues, and it's just unfortunate. It's too bad because I love
Yeah.
an actual print magazine. I've got probably every issue of the Outdoor Photographer over the last 4 years.
Yeah.
A
It was a great
collection of.
magazine, and I'm sad they're not even, printing it anymore, but
I
hopefully
was
something
yeah,
else will arise to,
I was
replace that.
equally as sad when Shutterbug stopped printing and then Popular
Yeah.
Photography stopped printing, and I just couldn't believe it. But I guess it is what it is. Now, how often do you sell prints and how do you sell them? How do you go about advertising, and are you featured in any galleries?
I'm not in any galleries, so I just sell online, and print sales can be like really, really sporadic. I'll go like a month without selling something, and then all of a sudden in one day sell like three or four different prints. So it is always kind of exciting when I get the notification on my phone that I've sold something. But definitely like the holiday season is definitely the busiest. People buying prints for Christmas presents or gifts for people. So I just try to advertise on my social media and sell prints that way. I would eventually one day like to get in a gallery space somewhere, whether that's a local place here or having my work featured somewhere else. But for now, it's mostly just online.
How do you like to display your prints, whether online in frames, acrylic, metal, canvas, or something else?
So anything that I sell is just online and I just order on demand, but I do have quite a few prints in my home. I personally really like the metal prints just because they're easy to hang and it just arrives, ready to hang. So you don't have to mess with like framing or anything. But I do also really like the way that, just the traditional print, photo paper print looks. I haven't printed anything on canvas, but that's something that I, want to do just to try out and see how it looks, just a different, printing medium.
Do you shoot during the winter months, and how does that challenge you if you do?
I do. I get cold really easily, so I definitely have to, put on lots of layers, hand warmers, all of that. And it's a lot more challenging in the winter because the wildlife is less active. But the nice thing is that the tracks of wildlife show up a lot easier when there's snow. So I spend a lot more time in the winter hiking and mostly snowshoeing, looking for wildlife and tracking wildlife to see, what's moving and where in order to try to line up trying to get some photos.
What's your favorite time of year?
I really like that like in between spring and winter when there's still, some snowstorms, but everything's starting to turn green. And I think mostly because that's the time of year that, the bear activity starts picking up after they've left hibernation. And that's definitely my favorite animal to photograph. So when it's that time of year and the bears start waking up, I just get so excited to be out in the field as often as I can looking for bears.
Well, how did you get so good at wildlife and nature photography?
I think I just got really hooked really quickly. In the beginning, I just wanted to practice as often as I could in order to get better photos. And I spent a lot of time looking at some of my photos that I had thought were really, really good and looking at them and then comparing to other people's photos and looking like, well, this photo isn't really in focus or the background is a little messy and trying to look at what other photographers were doing and in photos that I liked in order to try to figure out what they were doing to help improve my photography as well. And also looking and watching YouTube videos and different tips from people on especially how to edit photos really helped me at the beginning. I had no idea how to edit any photos at all. So those kinds of videos were really, really helpful.
Do you prefer any of your photos in black and white?
I think I've maybe put like two or three photos in black and white. I much prefer color just because I think it's a lot more natural. And I like looking at a photo and making it look like the way that it like looked and felt out in the field. And there's just such like subtle colors and vibrant colors that, the subjects that I photograph are all pretty, kind of plain brown. But the environments that they're in are always very colorful. And I like kind of being able to highlight that in my photos.
Do you strictly photograph in the wild, or do you also photograph animals that are in captivity?
I've only ever photographed, wild animals out in nature. And I really enjoy that and the different kind of like emotions and different kind of behaviors that you can pick up in the wild like that as well.
And how do you approach a new location you haven't shot before?
I do a lot of research online. So before my trip up to Alaska last year, I was researching, the different places to photograph, other photographers' experiences, reading different blogs from different photographers, and also researching the behaviors of the animals that I wanted to photograph, just to get a better idea of, the how the time of year affects them, the time of day when they're most active, everything like that. Just trying to learn as much as I can before I get there.
What's some other advice you can give to other established or aspiring wildlife photographers?
I think for wildlife, especially learning about your animal's behavior that you're wanting to photograph is really important. So you're not out there, looking for some animal that isn't even active that time of day is really, really impactful. And I also just think practicing as often as you can. So when I was starting out, I just throw the tennis ball for my dog and even just practice photographing her and getting used to tracking an animal that's moving. And that really helped a lot as well.
You have any advice for photographing wildlife in less than ideal lighting conditions?
I was just talking to a friend the other day, and I said that I would rather photograph something when it's like almost dark than in the middle of the day when there's no clouds around. Because that harsh lighting, I think, it's the hardest lighting
Yeah.
condition to photograph in. I would say to underexpose the photograph because it's easier to edit back and kind of regain some of the detail from shadows than highlights. So I always try to underexpose in that really harsh lighting.
What's your favorite lens?
My go-to is the Canon 300 millimeter 2.8. And I use that on my R5, which has a pretty high megapixel count and resolution. So I can crop in a lot farther than I would with, a lower resolution camera. So anything else, I'd always kind of say that people should use a lens 300 or longer for wildlife, especially places like Yellowstone when wildlife is often a little bit further away.
What type of wildlife do you find in Wyoming?
We're really lucky to have, so many different animals here. I primarily focus like the megafauna and focus on photographing them, like, bears, elk, moose, and all the other big animals that we have here. I also like kind of photographing birds of prey when I see them. But I mean, Wyoming's great because I've even photographed, deer and raccoons and eagles and stuff within city limits here in Cody. So you don't really have to venture far to find wildlife.
Do you go out and shoot during storms?
I have a little bit more so like in snowstorms than rain. And it is a little bit challenging, especially using autofocus. I usually have to switch to manual focus in order to get the animal in focus in some heavy snow.
What other types of photography do you like to shoot?
I mostly focus on wildlife, but I also really like traveling. So when I travel, I like doing, any sort of travel photography, even if it's just with my camera, cityscape, landscape, anything like that, just even with my cell phone.
How do you avoid burnout? Do you have other hobbies and interests that help at all?
I feel like I've struggled more leaning towards burnout this year. So there's been several different things that I've done. The first is I won't go to Yellowstone or go out in the field shooting if I don't really want to go. Sometimes I'll think like, well, I don't really want to go, but I should go. And on those days when I think that, I just don't go at all in order to, prevent burnout. I also try not to spend more than like 3 days a row in the field without having a break day in between. And the break days, I try to, do some editing and stuff like that, but also focus on, other hobbies. Maybe I'll go fishing or I'll read a book just to take a step back from photography for a bit.
How do you use lighting and composition to capture mood and emotion in wildlife photography?
I feel like lighting is almost the most crucial part of a photograph. And I really like shooting on cloudy days when it's, a little bit more moody lighting. So I actually check the weather forecast and look for cloudy days. And that's how I decide, if I have a week's time that I could go out in the field any day, I'll look and see when the cloudy days are, and I'll go out in the field on those days, just to try to get some of that better lighting. And I also feel like composition is important, especially when it comes to like cropping, when you could have a million different ways that you could crop a photo. So I always try to leave some room for the direction that the animal's looking or moving in, just to not make it feel like it's trapped, in that photo.
What are your thoughts on how AI is changing the state of photography?
I think with AI, it's getting a lot easier for people to completely change the way that a photo looks. And maybe you have like an idea of a photo that you want to create, but instead of, putting the time out in the field to get that photo, you can use AI to manipulate the photo. I think it can also lead to a lot more like, different kinds of maybe like creative work and stuff with photography. But I feel like you have to, if you're using, AI to like significantly alter a photo, that you should disclose that and say that at that point, to me, it's more art than it is a photograph.
It's more of a whole nother category, in other words.
Yeah.
What is your favorite animal to shoot?
I really like photographing the grizzly bears. They're just so expressive, and there's several different individual bears that I photographed for several years now. So it's always kind of exciting when I see one of those bears and looking to see, how they're doing, and just their different individual personalities is really fun to be able to watch and photograph.
Do you teach any photo workshops or lead any kind of photo tours?
I don't, but it's something that I've thought about, trying to start taking people into Yellowstone or something like that. I think this winter I'm going to offer like remote one-on-one sessions with people to either, talk about anything, whether you're planning a trip to Yellowstone and you want some advice on where to go, or if you want to, some editing tips or a portfolio review, something like that. So I'm trying to get that set up for the winter months when I'm a little bit less busy out in the field.
Do you have any workshops that you can recommend?
I know some friends of mine that guide photo tours. Kate Oxman guides out of Gardner, and she's a professional photographer. So I'd recommend her for anyone specifically in Yellowstone wanting to photograph wildlife.
What are some questions you ask yourself when you're taking a photo?
I feel like wildlife photography happens so fast that sometimes I don't even have time to think on what I'm shooting. I just kind of have to, go for it. But I always try to pay attention to not, clipping any of the animal out of the frame. Trying to make sure that, like, if it's an elk, that all of his antlers are in the frame and the ends aren't cut off, or making sure that I have the feet of an animal in the frame as well. And that just makes it easier later on to, if I want to do a full body portrait or shot, I can leave it like that. But if it's like just, the feet are cut out, then I crop it a little bit differently. So you can't really tell that I made that mistake.
What are some essential items that every wildlife photographer must have other than a camera and lenses?
I'd always say an extra camera battery. It seems like anytime that I'm out hiking and I have the camera battery in my camera, and there's been a few times that then that battery dies and I have no other battery. So I always keep an extra one in my pocket. And also binoculars are really, really helpful to be looking for wildlife. I feel like there's been times that I've just scanned with my camera and then I pick my binoculars up and then I find something that I didn't see that was obvious with my camera.
Are most of your photos taken with a tripod, or a monopod, or handheld?
I do most of my photography handheld. I do have a tripod that I'll use if I'm doing like any videography or anything like that, just to get a little bit more stable. But most of my photography is handheld because then I can, move around easier and change positions.
So when you do use a tripod, what kind of tripod do you use?
I use a Jitso Mountaineer, I think Series 3, and I just got their gimbal fluid head, which is I've really enjoyed using, especially for videography.
What techniques do you use for post-processing your images? And what software do you prefer?
I edit almost everything in Lightroom. I'll use Photoshop for like a few minor things, but almost everything in Lightroom. And I really like Lightroom. And after learning all the different like masking features, that's definitely my favorite part in order to, edit the subject and the background independently, instead of just making edits to the entire photo. And so that's probably my favorite feature in Lightroom.
Now, Julia, were there any topics that we didn't discuss today that you'd like to elaborate on at all?
One thing that I'd like to mention is just the ethics of wildlife photography. I think it can be really easy to be like, oh, I really want to get this shot and, kind of take shortcuts and do practices that wouldn't necessarily be ethical. But to me, I really try to stay ethical at all times in the field and, stay far enough away from all the animals and not use anything like calls or baiting or anything like that, or anything that would affect the animal's behavior.
Have you ever, whether on purpose or inadvertently, have you ever put yourself in harm's way to get a photo?
I don't think so, but there are definitely times where you have to really be paying attention to an animal's body language, and especially with like herd animals like moose or elk or something like that, where you could be somewhere and something else is like sneaking up behind you, that you really have to be aware of your surroundings at all times and know when it's time to pull away from a scene if you're disturbing that animal's behavior.
Well, Julia, where can listeners go to be able to find your work and view it and look at it? And I'd recommend that everybody does go and look at Julia's work, because my reaction has just been absolutely stunned because it's just amazing.
Thank you. I'm on Instagram and it's julia.littlelightningnature. And then I also have a website as well, and that's just littlelightningnature.com.
Where did the name Little Lightning Nature come from, if you don't mind me asking?
Little Lightning was my nickname when I was a kid. My mom and grandma called me that. And I don't really know why. I've never really asked, but that's where I drew the inspiration from.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Julia, it was really good to talk to you again.
Yeah, great talking to you, and thanks for having me on again.
You bet. Have a great day.
You too.
This has been the Wyoming Photographic Podcast, all things photography in the state of Wyoming. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.